What would you do if the home you bought for your parents, out of love, became the place they slowly let someone else take from you? That was the question I never imagined I'd have to face. Yet it arrived quietly, wrapped in the soft footsteps of my sister, who moved into the house without permission, without discussion, without even the courtesy of acknowledging the boundaries we had all signed together. What began as a simple act of support spiraled into months of silence, avoidance, and choices made in the shadows of family comfort. I bought that house with every intention of giving my parents stability. They had spent their lives sacrificing, saving in quiet, unglamorous ways, and I wanted to give them something that felt safe, something that felt earned. To protect all of us, I placed the house in a trust. Clear rules, clear intentions, everything written so no one would ever have to fight about it. But families rarely fall apart in grand scenes. They slip, inch by inch, through small moments. Unanswered calls, subtle shifts, rooms repurposed without permission. I watched the boundaries blur until I could barely recognize them. And when the trust was violated, when the lines were crossed so deeply they couldn't be ignored, I had to choose. Protect peace or protect truth. This is the story of what happens when clarity becomes the only way forward. A story about love, responsibility, and the quiet strength it takes to remain steady when everyone else hopes you'll bend. If this story resonates with you, even a little, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the full journey that follows. I bought the house the same week my promotion letter arrived. An uncomplicated, single-story place with a porch that caught the afternoon light. My parents stood in the kitchen when I brought them the news, my mother still wiping her hands on a dish towel out of habit. My father pretending to check the kettle, although it had already cooled. The room smelled faintly of mint tea, the kind they made when something good happened, but they didn't want to look too excited. They smiled the way people smile when they're grateful, but unsure what their gratitude might cost. I told them the house was theirs to live in, that it was meant to give us all a little peace after how hard the past few years had been. My mother touched the counter like she was afraid it might disappear. My father said, softly, "It's a good house." The sentence round and careful, as if testing its weight before letting it settle in the air. The trust documents came later, neatly drafted, 4 signatures required, each clause trimmed to its legal bone. An exclusive use provision, plain as daylight, sat in the middle of page 3. I liked how clear it sounded. No subletting, no transferring possession, no extended tenants other than my parents. Just the clean structure of boundaries, written down before emotion could smudge them. I explained I wanted the house protected from messy disputes, the kind I'd seen tear other families apart when someone misplaced a promise. My parents nodded, not at the language itself, but at the idea that paperwork was something serious people did. My father murmured, "Whatever keeps things simple," though his eyes said he trusted me more than any piece of paper ever drafted. I walked them through each major point: duration, responsibilities, the clause requiring written consent for any significant change. They listened the way people listen to a sermon they agree with but don't fully follow. Patient, respectful, slightly lost. My father repeated, "Trong nhà, nói với nhau là đủ," almost to himself, out of an old instinct that words were stronger when spoken close, not typed on formal stationery. I didn't correct him. Instead, I assured them the trust existed not to control them, but to shield us from misunderstandings that could grow teeth later. My mother squeezed my wrist as if to say she knew my intentions were clean, even if the legalese felt foreign. They signed with small, slow strokes, trusting the relationship more than the document resting under their hands. When they left the kitchen to explore the house again, I stayed behind and arranged the documents into a single folder, thick, ivory, the kind that clicked shut with a soft certainty. I labeled it with crisp black ink, House Trust, Originals. There was something grounding about the neatness of it, like placing a boundary in a drawer where it couldn't be bumped out of alignment by feelings. The kitchen light fell across the table, catching the glossy surface of the folder as if stamping it with quiet approval. I slid it to the center of the table, squared its edges, and felt a small, surprising sense of belonging. Like I had finally done something that made me an adult in my parents' eyes, even if they were too polite to say it. The folder stayed there when I stepped back, perfectly still on the wooden table, its edges illuminated by a narrow shaft of late-day sun cutting through the blinds. That one slice of light made the folder look heavier than it was, like it held not only documents, but the first hint of a story we hadn't stepped into yet. The air felt paused around it, the way a room does right before someone says something that changes the temperature of the moment. It was just paper, I told myself, just signatures and terms. But the way it sat there, so deliberate, made me feel as though I had placed a marker on a map without realizing the terrain it would influence. I touched the spine lightly, more out of instinct than intention, then pulled my hand back almost immediately. The folder didn't need anything from me anymore. It simply existed, patient and unassuming, waiting for the day someone might open it with real attention. At that moment it was harmless, ordinary even. No one had studied it closely. No one had felt its weight the way I someday would. I closed the kitchen light, glanced once more at the folder resting in the quiet, and told myself everything was clear, agreed upon, stable. A beginning with clean lines. The first bill arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded neatly inside an envelope marked household occupant. I stared at that phrase longer than I meant to. It wasn't wrong, technically, but it also wasn't the wording I expected, after establishing a trust with such clean boundaries. I paid it without hesitation. Maintenance was always my responsibility. But something about the shift in language made me save the PDF into a folder titled House/Trust Logs and annotate it with the date and time. Not because I thought it would matter, but because I'd learned that paper trails, like fences, protected relationships better than intentions alone. When I forwarded the receipt to myself, the timestamp glowed in the corner, 8:42 a.m. I wondered if my parents noticed the change or simply assumed bills had their own logic. The kitchen light was off when I visited that weekend. My father rubbed his thumb along the counter, mentioning a flicker in the hallway bulb. Small things, small shifts, nothing that felt dangerous yet, just the faint rustle of something moving under the surface. My parents began calling the house our place, with a gentle certainty, the kind that made the words feel older than the trust document itself. "We should repaint our porch," my mother said one afternoon, testing swatches against the siding. My father added, "Our bedroom gets the best morning light," as though correcting a minor detail. I smiled back, because what else was I supposed to do? Tell them their own home was borrowed under conditions they barely remembered? Still, every time I heard our, something tightened just below my ribs, a thin thread of unease that didn't belong to affection. The trust hadn't been written to separate us. It was meant to hold us steady. But language has a way of drifting when no one tethers it. I told myself they were just settling in, building comfort, believing in permanence. And yet, walking from room to room, I noticed how their voices warmed at the word ours, while mine had grown quieter, like I was stepping back from a picture I'd framed, but wasn't sure I still fit inside. That night I sent a short, careful email, just a summary of the trust conditions. No pressure, no alarm. I attached the original PDF with its clean margins and crisp clauses, adding a single line, just to keep everything clear from the start. I reread the message several times, adjusting verbs, softening the tone, pulling emotion out of the sentences until only clarity remained. My mother responded with a heart emoji, my father with "got it," though I doubted he opened the attachment. Their trust in me was unquestioned. Their trust in the document was optional. I didn't mind, at least not then. I only wanted us aligned before the lines blurred any further. The house was quiet when I visited later that weekend, the kind of quiet that feels full instead of empty. My mother set out tea without comment about the email, and my father asked if I'd eaten. Kindness doesn't always see the boundaries it crosses. During dinner, the conversation drifted to my sister, who had been struggling again. Work unstable, finances thin, choices inconsistent. My mother's eyes softened the way they always did when talking about her, a mixture of worry and hope wrapped into the same expression. My father cleared his throat as if preparing to negotiate the air between us. The spoon in my hand tapped the edge of my bowl, a small metallic sound that felt louder than it should have. I listened, not unkindly, but with the awareness that the trust had been built precisely to prevent the house from becoming a solution to someone else's crisis. I didn't want to say that out loud. It felt too sharp, too calculated for a meal shared under warm lighting. My mother suggested temporary help, her voice low. My father stayed silent. I realized then how a family can sit at the same table, yet imagine different futures for the same space. "I'll help," I said, keeping my tone steady, but only within the scope of the agreement. The words landed gently, or at least I tried to make them sound that way, though tension flickered across my father's face for half a second. He nodded once, slow, resigned, accepting the answer but not entirely warming to it. My mother folded her napkin with unnecessary precision, smoothing the creases as though she could iron worry out of cloth. I knew my response sounded colder than I meant. I also knew I couldn't afford vagueness. Clarity was what protected us from conflict disguised as generosity. Dinner continued, but something in the room shifted, a faint chill in the pauses, a subtle heaviness in the air. I wished then that boundaries didn't have to make me the careful one, the pragmatic one, the one who spoke in terms instead of feelings. But someone had to. After dinner, a soft breeze pushed through the cracked kitchen window, lifting the edge of the curtain and brushing cool air across my arm. My mother washed dishes slowly, water running in steady lines. My father dried them without speaking. I leaned against the counter and watched the curtain sway, noting the fragile calm. I told myself not to make any decisions too quickly. Just observe, document, breathe. Families don't unravel in a single moment. They loosen, thread by thread, when no one pulls gently to tighten the weave. On my phone, I opened the Notes app and typed a few simple words. The edge of the boundary is shifting. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't need to. I simply saved it with a date and let it rest there, quiet and accurate. My mother asked for a spare key on a Sunday morning, phrasing it lightly, as though it were no more significant than borrowing a measuring cup. "Just for convenience," she said. Her smile curved in a way that suggested she hoped I wouldn't make it formal. But convenience has a way of mutating into access, and access into assumption. I handed her the key anyway, placing it in her palm with a gentleness that belied the email I sent an hour later, a short note outlining the limits of use and the need to keep occupancy within the trust's terms. I hated how transactional it felt, like I had turned a family request into a legal handshake. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji, which did nothing to reassure me she understood the difference between having a key and having permission. Still, I told myself it was safer this way. People don't violate boundaries they fully understand. At least, that's what I believed then. My father tried to break the tension with humor that didn't land the way he intended. "We don't need all that formality," he said, chuckling as if we were discussing something trivial. But the smile never reached his eyes. It hovered on his face like a fragile sticker losing its adhesive. I knew he wasn't dismissing me. He was dismissing the discomfort, the implication that something as innocent as a key needed clarification. But when families share space, even symbolic space, Misunderstandings tend to arrive quietly, disguised as casual remarks. I could feel the air tighten between us, that delicate moment when affection brushes against expectation, and both sides hope the other won't push harder. I didn't argue. Sometimes silence preserves more than words can fix. Still, I filed the moment away, an unpolished stone, dropping into the archive of things I would later revisit, not because I wanted to, but because I'd have no choice. Later that night, I sat alone at my desk, reviewing the email confirmation I'd sent about the key and the boundaries it came with. I took a screenshot of the message, not for drama, but for accuracy. Documentation is its own kind of memory, cleaner and far less biased than the human kind. The computer cursor blinked at the end of the sentence I'd written, as though waiting for me to admit something I didn't yet have language for. The timestamp read 8:12 p.m., a detail that stuck with me longer than it should have. There's something about quiet hours that sharpens intuition, that makes small concerns feel like early warnings rather than passing thoughts. I saved the file into the trust folder, organizing it by date, labeling it simply. Then I sat back and watched the screen dim, wondering when I started needing proof for things families promised would never require it. My sister reacted with cheerful efficiency, dropping a quick, "Thanks, sis," in the family group chat when she saw the update about the spare key. She added a smiley face, the bright yellow kind that flattens nuance and replaces it with easy enthusiasm. I stared at the little icon longer than the message itself. Her reaction felt too quick, too light, like she was grateful for an opening I hadn't realized I'd created. It wasn't suspicion, just a hum of recognition, the way you sense a draft before knowing which window is open. My parents chimed in with similarly brisk replies, and for a moment, it felt almost normal, like we were still a family, untouched by legal frameworks or delicate boundaries. But something inside me hesitated. It was as if I'd missed a step on a familiar staircase. Not enough to fall, just enough to notice how easily balance can shift when no one is looking. To steady myself, I repeated a quiet truth I had believed since the day I drafted the trust. Paper protects relationships, not because it solves problems, but because it makes intentions undeniable. I reminded myself I wasn't creating distance, I was preserving clarity, the kind that keeps affection from being stretched until it tears. Still, that reassurance felt thinner than usual. A warm intention, when pressed against reality, can turn cool. As I sat at the kitchen counter in my small apartment, I realized how strange it was that the trust, meant to simplify things, was slowly becoming a lens through which every action, every request, every sentence needed to be examined. I didn't want to feel defensive. I didn't want to be the one watching for cracks, but early signs don't disappear just because we ignore them. They deepen. In my journal, I wrote a single line. Words aren't the same as documents. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't meant to be. It was a simple observation, the kind that arrives when emotion finally steps aside and leaves room for honesty. Families make promises with warmth, but paperwork preserves them when warmth falters. I snapped the notebook shut and sat still for several minutes, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft traffic outside my window. Nothing dramatic happened, but something subtle did. A shift, a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the first crack had formed. It was almost invisible, but undeniable. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the truth settle without resisting it. Some lines blur slowly, some begin as a whisper. My sister's car pulled up so close to the porch that the front tire kissed the edge of the flower bed. The trunk popped open before the engine even shut off. She hauled out 2 overstuffed suitcases, The kind you pack when you're not planning to leave soon. I watched from the driveway as she brushed past me, rolling one suitcase over the porch threshold, then the next. Dust lifted in the beam of afternoon sun as she entered what used to be my room. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand the timeline when, a few nights to get back on her feet, had quietly shifted shapes into something heavier, larger, unnamed. Her voice floated down the hallway. "This room still feels the same." I stepped inside long enough to see her tossing a blanket onto the bed like planting a claim. She didn't notice the tension in my shoulders, or maybe she did and pretended not to. Either way, the house had gained a new occupant, and I felt the shift like a door closing somewhere behind me. My parents stood together in the kitchen when I confronted them, their posture already apologetic before I said a word. "Just for a few weeks," my mother said, folding her hands the way she did whenever she hoped I wouldn't press further. My father avoided meeting my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know about whether they'd discussed this with her beforehand. I asked when the decision had been made. My mother said it hadn't been a decision, just a response to her situation. It was strange how easily compassion could override clarity. I wanted to understand, and a part of me did. Life gets messy, families step in. But intention doesn't erase structure, and structure was the only thing keeping us from slipping into the very conflicts the trust was built to prevent. "She only needs a little time," my father added, almost whispering it, as if the softness would make the breach feel smaller than it was. I reminded them gently, then more directly, that the trust included a clause requiring exclusive occupancy. My sister's move-in wasn't a small favor, it was a triggering event. "I'm not talking about feelings," I said carefully. "I'm talking about terms we all agreed to." My mother's face tightened at the formality of the word terms. My father sighed, pressing his fingertips against his brow, as though the language itself caused him discomfort. They said they hadn't realized, that things had escalated quickly, that they didn't want to make her feel unwelcome. I held the folder in my bag like a weight I wasn't ready to lift. "I'm not asking for anyone to feel unwelcome," I said. "I'm asking for us to stay inside the boundaries that protect all of us." The sentence hung between us like a rope pulled taut, neither side willing to let go, but no longer able to pretend it wasn't under strain. My father tried to diffuse the moment by appealing to what he called family understanding, a phrase that always sounded warm but dangerously vague. "We don't need to turn this into conflict," he murmured. I kept my hands in my pockets so he wouldn't see them tighten. "I'm not turning it into anything," I said. "But I can't ignore what the agreement requires." He inhaled slowly, as though preparing to argue, then let the breath out without speaking. My mother moved toward the pantry, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. The kitchen had always been our safe place. Neutral ground, steady lighting, familiar smells. But now it felt smaller, the walls carrying the weight of a truth none of us wanted to face. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was disappointment, layered and quiet, settling in the space between the life they wanted to preserve and the boundaries I was expected to uphold. The sound came from down the hallway, a clean mechanical snap as my sister tested the lock on my old bedroom door. Then the wheels of her suitcase rolled across the hardwood, slow, unhurried, final. That simple combination of noises struck deeper than any argument. It signaled presence, permanence, a shift already in motion. I closed my eyes briefly, cataloging the moment because I knew I would need accuracy later. My sister emerged and gave a quick, cheerful, "All settled," as if she were announcing good news. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked at my parents and asked, in as steady a voice as I could manage, whether they understood what this meant for the trust. They didn't answer, and in their silence I felt the distance widening, the kind you don't notice until you hear the echo. I reached into my bag, fingers brushing the spine of the folder, but I didn't pull it out. Not yet. There's a moment in every conflict when you realize you're standing at the edge of something that will reshape a relationship. This was that moment. I stepped back from the kitchen counter, letting the quiet settle. My sister hummed to herself as she rearranged drawers in the room that was no longer mine. My mother pretended to look for a misplaced dish towel. My father stared at the floor. I told myself to breathe, to wait, to act carefully. Not everything needs to be confronted instantly. Some truths need a moment to settle before they can be spoken without breaking more than they fix. I left the folder zipped inside my bag and walked toward the door, knowing the next step would be unavoidable, only choosing when, not whether, it would come. My sister hung her jackets in the closet of my old room as if she'd lived there for years, humming while sliding each hanger into place. "Feels good to have my own spot again," she said, stretching her arms like someone settling into a long-term lease. My own spot. The phrase pressed against my ribs, sharp but subtle. I stepped inside just far enough to catch the scent of her detergent, lavender mixed with something unfamiliar. Filling the room that once held the smell of my books, my late-night coffee, my life before any of this. She didn't notice my hesitation. She was too busy making herself comfortable, claiming space with the casual certainty of someone who had never had to think about ownership. I watched her drape a sweater over the foot of the bed and realized she wasn't borrowing the room. She was taking it, and everyone else was letting her. My mother entered a few minutes later holding a small stack of folded towels. "Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a bit," she said gently, as though offering a reasonable suggestion rather than asking me to step aside from the very home I had placed in trust for them. My father stood behind her, arms crossed in a way that signaled agreement without having to say it. The request hung between us like smoke, soft but impossible to ignore. "It'll give your sister some breathing room," my mother added, her voice almost apologetic. I looked around the space, the bed I once slept in, the nightstand I bought with my first internship paycheck, the walls that still held faint outlines where my framed photos used to hang. It felt strange, being nudged out of a room that wasn't really mine anymore, but wasn't hers either. A place suspended between legal ownership and emotional entitlement. I gathered a few essentials: clothes, a laptop charger, a couple of books, packing quickly to avoid letting emotions seep into the process. "I'll be fine," I said, the words steady even as my fingers trembled slightly. I didn't want them to see the tremble. I didn't want anything to look like hurt. My father nodded as if my composure confirmed this was the simplest solution. My sister poked her head out of the room and said, "Thanks for understanding," her tone bright, unbothered. She didn't ask where I was going or how long I'd be gone. I stepped onto the porch, the cool air brushing against my face, grounding me. Leaving felt like acquiescence, but staying would have been worse. A silent acceptance that boundaries no longer mattered. I told myself to breathe, to move, to choose clarity over conflict, even if the clarity stung. My father walked me to the car, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the driveway gravel. "You can be flexible," he said softly, "just until she settles." I closed the trunk and met his gaze. "I can be flexible within the legal framework," I answered. The distinction landed somewhere between us, quiet but firm. He blinked slowly, absorbing it, perhaps wishing I'd chosen a different vocabulary, something warmer, something more forgiving. But warmth was what had put us here. Warmth without boundaries always asked me to give more than I should. He nodded, not in agreement but in resignation. A father accepting a truth he didn't want to carry. I got into the car, feeling his eyes on me, knowing he believed he was asking for kindness while overlooking the cost. Families do that sometimes, confusing sacrifice for love. As I pulled away, the rearview mirror framed the house in a narrowing rectangle. The porch light was on, washing the front steps in a pale glow. My sister's silhouette moved across the hallway, claiming the space as her own without hesitation. The house grew smaller in the mirror, until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the curve of the street. My chest tightened, not with regret, but with something closer to clarity. Leaving wasn't a retreat. It was documentation in motion. A moment I would need to remember with precision. I gripped the steering wheel and drove toward the temporary apartment I'd booked earlier, reminding myself that distance can sometimes be the most honest form of protection. Protection for them, for me, for the agreement we had all once promised to honor. In the quiet of the parking lot outside my temporary place, I sat for a long moment, letting the engine tick into silence. I whispered to myself, "Don't decide anything tonight. Just observe." It was a simple instruction, but it kept my mind steady. Not every violation requires an immediate response. Some require careful watching, noting, allowing the truth to reveal itself fully. I opened my phone and typed a short line into my documentation log. Sister relocated into protected property. Parents requested I vacate. Facts, not feelings. The distinction mattered. I locked the car, walked toward the small apartment, and reminded myself, this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of understanding how far the boundaries had already started to bend. The room I rented was smaller than it had looked online. 4 walls painted a tired off-white, a thin mattress that dipped slightly in the center, and a window that faced a narrow alley, echoing with the soft groans of old plumbing. The light above the bed flickered once, before settling into a dim yellow glow that made everything feel both temporary and exposed. I set my suitcase down near the door and listened to the muffled noises around me. Footsteps from the unit upstairs, a faucet running somewhere down the hall, the hum of a refrigerator I couldn't see. This wasn't home. It wasn't even close. But it was neutral, unclaimed, uncomplicated. A space where no one's expectations seeped through the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly, letting the quiet wrap around me. Sometimes distance feels like exile. Sometimes it feels like a clean slate. Tonight, it was both. I unpacked just enough to make the room functional. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, my laptop, and placed a small cardboard box on the floor beside the bed. On top of it rested the folder. Its edges were slightly scuffed from travel, but it still held its quiet authority. The room felt different with it there, as if the air shifted around the weight of what it represented. I ran a finger along the corner of the box and realized how strange it was that the house I'd bought for security had pushed me into a space less than half its size. But the folder grounded me. It reminded me that clarity existed, documented and intact, even if the people involved had drifted from it. I looked around the cramped room, letting my eyes adjust to its imperfections, and told myself I could handle temporary discomfort. What mattered was accuracy, not comfort. I opened my laptop and pulled up the trust documents, reading through each clause slowly. Not because I doubted what they said, but because I needed to remind myself of the structure beneath the emotions. The exclusive use clause sat there, as clean and uncompromising as the day I drafted it. The words weren't sharp, they were precise. Precision is often mistaken for harshness, but it's what protects people when feelings get tangled. I leaned closer to the screen, letting the clarity steady me. Outside, a car door slammed, followed by footsteps fading down the alley. The world continued, indifferent to my small crisis. I scrolled down, highlighted a few lines, and took notes. Timestamps, observations, factual summaries. It wasn't about preparing for conflict. It was about staying tethered to the truth beneath everyone's interpretations. My phone buzzed, a silent vibration against the thin mattress. A message appeared in the family group chat. a picture my sister posted of her new workspace in the house. She'd claimed a corner of the dining area and rearranged the furniture without hesitation. A chair I'd chosen. A table I'd assembled myself years ago. My mother reacted with a heart emoji. My father left a thumbs up. I watched the image for a few seconds, feeling an odd mixture of detachment and clarity. This wasn't malice. It was entitlement softened by habit, nurtured by years of relying on me to adjust. I clicked the phone off without responding. Their silence after I left had been loud enough to answer any question about where their priorities were leaning. The house wasn't expanding. It was contracting around her presence. I glanced at the corner of the box again. The folder's spine reflected a faint line of yellow light from the bedside lamp. For a moment it looked almost alive, like a quiet reminder sitting patiently in the dimness. I traced the edge lightly with my thumb but didn't open it. The document didn't need rereading tonight. Its meaning hadn't changed. Only the circumstances around it had shifted. I sat back and let the room settle into stillness. Sometimes silence tells the truth more honestly than confrontation. I closed my eyes, committed the day's events to memory, and allowed myself to acknowledge one simple, steady fact. Boundaries don't disappear just because someone crosses them. They become clearer. Before going to sleep, I opened my task list and marked a new item. Prepare preliminary notice. Not to send yet, just a draft. Acting too quickly creates its own kind of harm, and I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in sequence, in careful steps that honored the clarity I had built from the start. I typed a short note summarizing the situation. Unauthorized occupancy, parental encouragement, personal relocation. Facts, not feelings. I saved the file and closed the laptop. Outside, the plumbing groaned again, and a faint gust of wind rattled the window. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the day settle evenly across my chest. This was the beginning of the line tightening, the moment before action, and I needed to rest before taking the next precise step. 2 days after I moved into the temporary room, a neighbor from my parents' street sent me a short video. "Thought you should know," the message read. In the clip, a contractor carried lumber through the side gate of the house, followed by the high-pitched whine of a drill. The caption under the video? "Looks like they're renovating the back bedroom." I watched it twice, noticing details I wished I could ignore. My sister's shoes placed neatly at the doorway, a paint tray leaning against the wall. The kind of organized chaos that suggested this wasn't spontaneous. Renovation isn't a few weeks. Renovation means settling in. I thanked the neighbor and saved the file, my thumb pressing the screen a second longer than necessary. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that a situation left unattended will always grow roots. Later that afternoon, another email arrived. An invoice for building materials and tools, again addressed to household occupant. The phrasing had become consistent, enough to be deliberate. I forwarded the invoice to my documentation folder, labeling it with the date, time, and a brief description. Each piece of evidence felt clinical, like assembling exhibits for a case I never wanted to build. Still, accuracy mattered. I wasn't preparing for battle. I was preserving the truth, in case anyone tried to rewrite it later. I imagined my sister at the hardware store, selecting items with the confidence of someone who believed the space already belonged to her. Families rarely announce their breaches. They drift into them, quietly, almost politely. I chose not to react immediately. Reaction is emotional. Observation is protective. I set up a small system on my laptop, timestamps organized by date, images cataloged, notes written with neutral language. The act of sorting calmed me, pulling me out of the fog of hurt and into the clarity of fact. The trust document wasn't a weapon, it was a map. And if I followed it carefully, I wouldn't lose myself in the maze of family dynamics. I clicked through each file, adjusting titles, aligning details. My sister's new workspace, the repairs, the messages, the shifts in language, all small threads leading toward a pattern. I sat back and let the pattern form without forcing interpretation. Some truths reveal themselves only when you stop trying to name them. That evening, my father called. His voice was warm, almost overly so, as if softening the edges of something he didn't want to say out loud. "Just wanted to check how you're settling in," he said. In the background, I heard my mother's faint voice and the scrape of furniture being moved. I asked what they were rearranging. He paused too long before answering. "Just organizing the place." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. We talked briefly about the weather, about my work, about anything except the house. Our conversation skimmed the surface like a stone that never sinks. When we hung up, I stared at the phone, recognizing the quiet truth behind his words. They were settling into a new arrangement, one they hoped I wouldn't challenge. I suggested we meet to go over the trust again, calmly, neutrally, as if it were a forgotten manual rather than the foundation of our agreement. My father hesitated. "Let's see first," he murmured. Those 3 words layered themselves over every earlier moment, confirming what I already sensed. They didn't want clarity. Clarity would require correction, and correction would mean asking my sister to leave. Avoidance was easier, softer, more familiar. I didn't push. Pressure applied too early fractures things that could otherwise be repaired. But I noted his response carefully, storing it alongside the video, the invoices, the silence after I moved out. Families don't break in dramatic scenes. They wear thin. That night, I wrote a simple sentence in my log. "Request for trust review postponed." Underneath it, I added another line. "Notice the pattern." I put the phone down and let the room settle into its usual hum, the buzzing pipes, the faint footsteps upstairs, the thin wall breathing with the night air. I didn't feel defeated. If anything, I felt steadier. Recognizing avoidance is its own form of clarity. The truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, carried through a half-open doorway, or a delayed answer on the phone. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness draw a calm border around me, and reminded myself that restraint can be a form of strength when used with intention. I drove to the house late in the afternoon, parking across the street instead of pulling into the driveway the way I used to. The front yard looked unchanged, trimmed grass, quiet porch, the same pale curtains moving faintly behind the windows. But something in the air felt different, as if the house itself held its breath. When I rang the doorbell, no one answered. I waited, listening. A dog barked somewhere down the block, and a car door slammed far away. I rang again, slower this time. Still nothing. I stepped back and looked at the windows, half expecting to see someone watching from inside. The silence felt intentional, like a conversation no one wanted to have. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. For the first time since buying the house, I felt like a visitor, standing on property I owned but was no longer allowed to enter. A text from my sister arrived as I was turning away. "Busy setting up my office, can't talk." There was a smiling face at the end of the message, a small, clipped gesture of dismissal. I stared at the words, at the way she called it my office, as though the house had reoriented itself around her needs. I typed a brief reply asking to speak in person, but the message remained unread. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked slowly toward the porch, letting the weight of her silence settle. The shift wasn't just physical, it was linguistic. Rooms were being renamed. Spaces were being claimed. And with each new label she placed on the house, my place in it grew smaller. When I finally stepped inside, using the key I still legally held but emotionally hesitated to use, my parents were in the living room. They looked up with expressions that weren't quite surprise but weren't welcome either. My mother offered a thin smile. My father's shoulders tightened. I mentioned the trust gently, reminding them of the occupancy conditions, the need to maintain clarity. My mother pressed her lips together, avoiding my gaze. My father shifted in his chair, the fabric creaking under the weight of everything left unsaid. Their discomfort hung in the air like humidity, heavy, pervasive, impossible to ignore. I asked again if we could sit down with the document together. Neither responded directly. Instead, my mother murmured something about not wanting to create tension, though tension was already sitting between us like a third presence. As we spoke, if it could be called speaking, the porch light flickered, then went out entirely. The hallway dimmed, shadows stretching across the floor. My father stood to check the switch, tapping it twice, but the light stayed dead. The sudden darkness made everything feel sharper. The tightness in my mother's jaw, the defensive quiet in the room, the unspoken expectation that I should let things slide for the sake of peace. My sister's footsteps echoed faintly from down the hall, but she didn't appear. The house felt like a stage where everyone knew their roles except me, the one who bought it, the one being asked to stay silent. I breathed in, tasting the thick stillness, aware of how much clarity hides itself in moments when light disappears. I stepped back toward the door, needing space to think, to breathe. As I grabbed my bag, my fingers brushed the edge of the folder inside. The contact felt cold, grounding. I hadn't come to threaten or enforce anything. I came to remind them of what we agreed to. But agreements mean little when people start deciding which parts to remember. I looked at my parents, two people I loved deeply. Two people who were now navigating guilt, loyalty, and avoidance in the same breath. The situation wasn't malicious, it was human. But being human doesn't negate responsibility. My mother whispered, "Let's not make this bigger." But her eyes asked a different question. Could I pretend not to notice? I couldn't. When I stepped back outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I opened the back of my car and reached for my laptop, drafting a preliminary notice right there on the street. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. The words were factual, steady, free of emotion. This is a notification of potential breach. I saved the document without sending it, closing the laptop with a quiet click. I looked up at the darkened porch, at the house I had trusted to hold us together. Tonight, it felt like a line had been crossed, even if no one wanted to admit it. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the engine stay off, letting the silence speak. Some truths become clearer only when the lights go out. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rented room, the surface barely wide enough to hold my laptop and a glass of water. The morning light crept in through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the screen as I drafted the first formal notice. I wrote slowly, choosing each word with deliberate care. Notice of potential breach, a phrase that felt heavier in practice than it ever had in theory. I outlined the timeline, the terms, the evidence, keeping the tone neutral, almost cold. Precision leaves no room for misinterpretation. As I typed, I could feel my heartbeat settle into a steady rhythm, as if my body recognized that clarity was its own kind of calm. I wasn't escalating anything. I was documenting, preserving the truth before memories softened or emotions redirected it. When I finished the draft, I saved the file with a simple name, pending, breach notice. The cursor blinked at me, indifferent and patient. I gathered the evidence into a clean folder, photos from the neighbor's video, invoices addressed to household occupant, screenshots of messages, logs of dates and times. Each piece felt strangely impersonal, as though I were curating someone else's story. I numbered them sequentially: EO1, EO2, EO3. The structure comforted me, giving me a sense of control in a situation that no longer felt grounded. I thought about how easily people shift their narratives, how memory smooths edges that should stay sharp. Evidence doesn't smooth, it holds its shape. I reviewed each item, checking for accuracy, ensuring there were no assumptions tucked between the lines. This wasn't about catching anyone in wrongdoing. It was about maintaining the integrity of something we all agreed to protect. Order restored a little piece of me. Next, I contacted the trustee's office and requested an appointment. The receptionist recognized my name, her voice polite but clipped as she confirmed a meeting for 10 a.m. in one of their smaller conference rooms. I stared at the confirmation email for a long moment before closing my laptop. The formality of it all felt surreal. I had envisioned the trust as a quiet safeguard, a protective structure that would never need activation. Yet here I was, preparing to step into a room where intention and documentation would face each other, without the cushioning warmth of family sentiment. The reality settled over me like a steady weight, one I could carry but not ignore. I told myself it was just procedure, nothing more, but my hands still felt warm when I folded them in my lap. Even calm has its temperature. My father texted that afternoon, "Let's not make this a big issue." The words were simple, but they carried layers: fear, avoidance, hope that I might step back into the role I'd always filled, the one who compromised first. I typed a long reply explaining the terms again, the need for clarity, the risk of ignoring boundaries. I deleted it. Then I typed something shorter. "I'm following the process we agreed to." A single sentence that didn't invite debate. He didn't respond. The silence stretched through the afternoon, threading itself through my other tasks. I tried to remind myself that silence isn't rejection. It's a decision to delay confrontation. Yet it still pricked at me, quietly, like a thorn catching the edge of a sleeve. Later that evening, I printed the section of the trust that dealt with exclusive occupancy, highlighting the clause about liquidation upon breach. The yellow stripe across the page looked harsh under the dim apartment lighting. I traced the line with my thumb, not to memorize it, I already knew it by heart, but to steady myself. I had created these terms to prevent precisely this situation: blurred lines, emotional reasoning, shifting explanations. Structure existed to hold relationships up, not break them down. Yet I knew that once this clause entered the conversation, nothing would remain in the soft, familiar space we once shared. I slipped the document into a protective sleeve and added it to my binder. Preparation is a form of respect, even when the truth it leads to is unwelcome. Before bed, I sat quietly on the edge of the mattress, letting the day untangle itself in my mind. The appointment was scheduled, the evidence organized, the language drafted. There was nothing more to do until the process moved forward. I closed my eyes and inhaled, holding the breath for a moment before letting it go. The room was still, the cheap blinds rattling slightly in the wind. I reached for the lamp and turned it off, the click echoing softly in the small space. As darkness settled, I whispered to myself, not as comfort, but as confirmation. Accuracy first, emotion after. I lay back, letting the ceiling disappear into shadow, knowing the next step had already begun. The trustee's office was colder than I remembered. Neutral colors, soft carpet, framed certificates aligned in tidy grids. A small conference room had been reserved for us, its round table positioned beneath a vent that hummed with unbothered efficiency. 3 pens were arranged perfectly parallel at the center, an intentional symmetry that made the space feel more formal than it needed to be. My parents sat side by side, their posture stiff but polite, as though attending a meeting they hoped would end quickly. I took the seat across from them, letting the quiet settle before opening the binder. My sister wasn't there, and I wasn't surprised. She rarely showed up when accountability was required. I smoothed a page with my palm and took one steady breath. No anger. No performance. Just clarity. I opened the folder to the exact page we needed, the section outlining exclusive occupancy. The paper made a soft sound against the table, barely audible, but firm enough to mark the shift in the room's atmosphere. I slid the document toward the trustee, who adjusted her glasses and read it aloud with measured cadence. As her voice moved through the lines, the language felt both familiar and strangely heavier than when I first drafted it. My parents listened, their eyes drifting between the trustee and the highlighted text. I could sense their discomfort, not with the terms themselves, but with hearing them spoken out loud, free of emotion, stripped of interpretation. Sometimes silence is not avoidance, it's acknowledgement that the words cannot be softened. The trustee paused briefly, tapping the page with her index finger. "This clause is clear," she said. "Exclusive use for your parents only. Any additional occupant constitutes a violation." Her tone wasn't accusatory, just factual, as though reading a weather report. I saw my father swallow hard, his gaze fixed on the table's glossy surface. My mother folded her hands tightly in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light. The reality of the agreement stood between us, unavoidable. I wasn't pointing fingers. I wasn't assigning moral failure. I was simply holding the document steady enough for everyone to see what was already written. The clarity of it all felt like standing in a room with bright lights, revealing, uncomfortable, necessary. The trustee continued reading, reaching the portion that outlined liquidation procedures triggered by a breach. The language was clinical, maybe even cold, but that coldness was the reason families avoid chaos. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's breath trembled faintly. I felt a flicker of guilt, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I could see how painful this was for them. Yet pain doesn't change the text. Pain doesn't rewrite consequences. This clause exists to protect all parties, the trustee added gently. It is not punitive, only procedural. I nodded. I had said these same words once, back when everyone believed they'd never matter. It was strange hearing them reflected back to me, as if the trust itself were speaking. When the trustee finished, I offered a solution, clear, concise, designed to prevent escalation. "We can document a corrective plan," I said. "A short written agreement. If the occupancy ends within the time frame, the process stops." My mother looked up, hope flickering across her face like a weak flame. My father hesitated, torn between loyalty and responsibility. "We just want peace," he murmured. "So do I." My voice didn't rise. It didn't even soften. Peace without boundaries isn't peace. It's delay. I placed a pen on the table between us, not as pressure, but as invitation. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. About honoring the very structure they had once thanked me for building. We signed the meeting record, my signature first, steady and precise, followed by my father's slow, careful pen strokes, and my mother's hesitant one. When the trustee added her initials, the room felt quieter, as though something intangible had been acknowledged. No one spoke as the folder closed with a muted sound, neither dramatic nor final, just the end of a necessary conversation. We filed out of the room without eye contact, our footsteps soft against the carpet. In the hallway I paused, letting my parents walk ahead. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I was steady. Sometimes clarity feels like standing alone, not because you want to, but because you have to. I exhaled slowly and followed them out. The corrective period passed quietly, almost deceptively so. I drove by the house one morning and noticed new items through the window. A standing lamp in the corner of my old room. A bookshelf that hadn't been there before. My sister's belongings weren't decreasing, they were multiplying. A faint ache settled in my chest, not from surprise but from confirmation. The trust's time frame wasn't merely being ignored, it was being overwritten in real time by choices no one wanted to address. I parked across the street again, watching the stillness of the porch. The neighborhood felt unchanged, but inside that house, the lines had shifted beyond what silence could mask. I checked the date on my phone. Deadline passed, corrective action unmet. Facts, as always, didn't carry emotion. They simply stood where they belonged. That afternoon, I sent the formal notice of breach. The digital signature stamped itself cleanly at the bottom, the inkless equivalent of a decisive breath. Unlike the preliminary notice, this one carried an air of finality. I drafted the accompanying email with the same precision I used when constructing the trust itself. Measured language, no blame, no sharp edges. Just the sequence of events, the clause violated, and the next procedural step. When I hit send, the whoosh of the outgoing message felt smaller than the weight behind it. I sat back in the chair, letting the silence fill the room, aware that I had crossed into territory that could not be undone. This wasn't retaliation, it was adherence, to the structure, to the promise, to what I had once created to protect all of us. My phone rang an hour later. My mother's voice trembled the moment she said my name. She asked for more time, her words wrapped in apology and exhaustion. I could hear the strain beneath her tone, the guilt tugging at her breath. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let her plead without interrupting. Then I spoke gently, keeping my voice steady. "This isn't punishment," I said. "It's the process we agreed on." She cried softly, not out of anger but out of fear. Fear of upheaval, fear of conflict, fear of losing the illusion that balance could be restored without consequence. I wished I could soften the truth for her, but softened truths always fracture later, when they matter more. We ended the call with a quiet goodbye neither of us felt ready for. My father called next, his tone more controlled but frayed at the edges. "We can fix this," he insisted. "Let's just talk it through." I listened. I always listened. But conversation wasn't what was needed anymore. Words had been used in place of action for weeks, stretching thin over contradictions they couldn't hold. "It has to be written," I reminded him. "Anything else won't last." He fell silent, and in that silence I felt the truth settle. He knew I was right, but wished I wasn't. The weight of responsibility lies heaviest on the person who sees the reality first. He finally sighed, a soft exhale of resignation, and told me he loved me. "I love you too," I replied. Love and boundaries are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same thing. I offered one final meeting before escalation, a moment for them to acknowledge the breach and choose the corrective step themselves, not as punishment, but as dignity. Giving someone the chance to participate in their own accountability is a kindness rarely recognized. My mother agreed immediately. My father agreed after a pause long enough for me to hear the fatigue settling in his chest. I scheduled the meeting for Tuesday morning. The email invite went out with neutral formatting: time, location, agenda. No emotion embedded between the lines. As I closed my laptop, I felt a strange combination of heaviness and clarity. We were moving forward, not around the truth, through it. That night, the house stayed quiet on my phone. No messages, no updates, no last-minute attempts to renegotiate the situation. I sat by the window of my small room, watching headlights slide past the alley wall, the shadows bending with each passing car. I thought about how boundaries, once broken, never truly return to their original shape. But they can still hold. They can still protect. I whispered a small, steady sentence meant only for myself. Stay grounded, stay exact. I closed the blinds and let the room darken. The next step was set. There was no anger in me, only direction. Tuesday morning arrived with a gray sky, the kind that made everything feel muted, as if the day itself understood the weight of what was coming. I arrived at the trustee's office a few minutes early, carrying the folder tucked firmly under my arm. My parents entered shortly after, moving quietly, almost cautiously, as if sound alone might fracture the tense air between us. The conference room felt colder than usual, its glass table reflecting our faces in dim fragments. I placed the original documents on the table and slid them forward. No speeches, no accusations, just the papers themselves, resting where everyone could see them. My mother rubbed her hands together slowly. My father cleared his throat but didn't speak. I felt a stillness settle inside me, not peace, but readiness. I flipped the folder open and ran my finger down the margin until it rested on the line that mattered most. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't frame it with commentary. I simply traced the sentence with the same care I had used when drafting it years ago. The language was unchanged, clean, precise, shaped to prevent exactly the moment we were now facing. As I read it silently, I sensed my parents watching me, waiting for an interpretation they already knew by heart. My father shifted in his seat. My mother blinked slowly, holding her breath for just a second too long. Words are gentler when spoken, but sharper when pointed to on paper. I let the silence carry the meaning forward. "This is the clause," I said finally, my voice low but steady. I tapped the sentence once. "Immediate sale in the event of loss of exclusive use." My mother inhaled sharply, as if hearing it for the first time. My father let out a quiet, defeated sigh. I wasn't trying to break anything. I was simply naming what already existed. The trustee leaned forward and confirmed the text in a neutral tone, neither siding with nor softening for any of us. Facts do not comfort, but they anchor. My sister wasn't there, but her absence filled the room more loudly than her presence might have. My parents exchanged a look, one part fear, one part resignation. I watched the moment land. My father's voice cracked slightly when he finally asked, "You're truly going to sell the house?" His eyes searched mine, hoping for a gentler truth. I held his gaze, steady but not unkind. "If the document says so," I answered. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a choice. It was the structure we had agreed to long before emotion complicated the landscape. My mother covered her mouth briefly, fighting the urge to plead again. The trustee nodded, confirming the next procedural step. Everything felt strangely suspended. The air, the moment, the quiet understanding that something intimate had shifted beyond repair. I felt the heaviness of it, but not regret. Some decisions aren't chosen, they're honored. The trustee outlined the liquidation process, each step delivered with careful professionalism. Appraisal, listing, documentation, finalization. My parents listened in silence, absorbing each word like a slow, dissolving truth. My mother placed a hand on my father's knee, grounding him, or maybe grounding herself. I offered them an option to correct things before the process advanced, but they both knew the time for that had already passed. My sister's choices had set a course none of us could now bend without breaking something deeper. I watched my parents' shoulders slump, a mixture of disbelief and quiet acceptance settling over them. I didn't rush them. Some realizations require their own pace. When the meeting ended, we stood up without speaking. My mother reached for the documents but stopped herself, withdrawing her hand as if touching them might burn. My father placed his palm briefly on my shoulder, an old gesture, familiar and faintly warm, but said nothing. We walked out of the room together, but not in unison. I felt the sharpness behind my eyes, the faint sting of emotion pressing forward, but it didn't spill. It stayed contained, measured, like everything else in this process. Outside, the sky remained gray, indifferent to the weight we carried. I exhaled, steady and long, knowing the boundary had now shifted from theory into action. The appraiser arrived at the house 2 days later. I met him outside, clipboard in hand, his expression polite but detached in the way professionals are when stepping into someone else's unraveling. Inside, he moved through each room with practiced efficiency, measuring walls, inspecting fixtures, photographing corners with the quiet click of a camera. My parents watched from the living room, sitting close together on the couch, their eyes following him like he was an intruder, even though he was merely doing his job. I handed him the folder of maintenance records I'd kept over the years, repairs I'd paid for, upgrades I'd supervised, receipts neatly stapled to each section. He nodded appreciatively, remarking that the documentation was unusually thorough. I didn't say it aloud, but thoroughness was the only reason we weren't already drowning in confusion. After completing his walkthrough, the appraiser asked about the improvements I'd funded before placing the house in trust. The replaced water heater, the roof repair, the new insulation in the attic. I listed them one by one, matching each upgrade with its corresponding documentation. My parents listened silently, and I wondered if they were only now realizing how many invisible choices had gone into building the stability they had lived inside. The appraiser checked boxes on his form, his pen gliding smoothly across the page. Efficiency is its own kind of mercy. There was no lingering, no drawn-out judgment, just tasks completed in sequence. When he finished, he thanked me and stepped out onto the porch, already turning his attention to the next appointment on his schedule. For him, this was routine. For us, it was the beginning of finality. Later that afternoon, the real estate agent arrived with a laptop and a calm, polished demeanor. She reviewed the appraiser's preliminary notes and asked about the home's history. I answered her questions succinctly. Purchase date, intention of the trust, improvements made over time. My parents sat at the dining table, hands folded, saying little. The agent then presented a range of potential listing prices, each tied to different market strategies. I asked for transparency, a full breakdown of comparable sales, inspection expectations, and buyer contingencies. She nodded and produced the data, organized neatly into a digital chart. The numbers were straightforward, indifferent to the emotional weight inside the room. My mother traced a fingertip along the table's edge. My father stared at the wall. It felt like we were all living inside a moment that refused to soften. When the agent suggested a timeline for listing, I insisted that every step be documented formally. No assumptions, no verbal agreements, just clarity. She seemed relieved, accustomed to families who struggled to communicate. At least our conflict had structure. As she typed notes into her tablet, my father stood and walked to the window, looking out as if searching for a version of the house untouched by contracts or consequences. My mother's eyes followed him, reflecting a sorrow deeper than frustration, something closer to understanding. I told them gently that this wasn't about fault. It was about alignment with the terms we had chosen together. They nodded, but neither spoke. Sometimes silence is the only way parents can admit their children are right. When the agent finished her documentation and prepared to leave, I sent a short message to my sister in the family group chat. The appraisal and listing preparations are underway. Please be present for the next steps. The message remained unread. A familiar ache settled behind my ribs, not sharp but persistent. A reminder that some people avoid the aftermath of their choices by stepping aside when accountability arrives. I closed my phone and slipped it into my pocket. Avoidance is a decision too. My parents stood behind me, quiet, weighted by the realization that this process had moved beyond possibility into inevitability. Procedure doesn't pause for hesitation. That evening, the agent emailed a confirmation of the upcoming open house schedule. I forwarded it to my parents and my sister, adding a brief note with the subject line, "Next steps, required attendance." After sending it, I sat alone in my car for a few minutes before driving away. The house behind me seemed unchanged, same windows, same porch, same stillness. But everything inside had shifted. I exhaled, letting the tension drain in small increments, and started the engine. The process was moving forward, not quickly, not aggressively, just steadily, the way truth progresses when no one can deny it anymore. My sister arrived at the house just before dusk, her footsteps sharp against the walkway. She didn't knock. She walked straight in, her jaw set, eyes already bright with anger. "You're being extreme," she said, before I could even greet her. She stood in the center of the living room, like someone ready to announce a verdict. My parents hovered behind her, anxious, as though they'd rehearsed this moment and hoped it would unfold differently. My sister's anger wasn't loud. It was pointed, directed, designed to push. "You didn't even talk to me," she added, arms folded tightly. I watched her, noticing the way her bravado wavered around the edges. Confrontation always reveals more than it intends. I breathed in slowly, letting the air steady me. "I wasn't here to argue. I was here to be exact. I followed what we agreed to," I said, keeping my voice even, "and what we signed." My sister scoffed, rolling her eyes as though legal agreements were optional recommendations. "You always hide behind paperwork," she snapped. "Families don't act like this." My father stepped forward, lifting a hand in an attempt to diffuse the tension. "Let's not escalate," he murmured. But escalation had already taken root, long before any of us stepped into this room. I held my ground. "This isn't about hiding," I replied. "It's about honoring the boundaries we set together." My sister shook her head, her breath quickening. She wasn't used to being told no, not by my parents, not by life, and certainly not by me. The silence that followed felt heavy, like a door slowly closing. My mother, gentle even in conflict, asked if we could handle this internally, a phrase she voiced with hope and fear braided together. She glanced between us, searching for an opening where none existed. "We're family," she whispered, the words trembling. I nodded softly, acknowledging the truth inside her worry. But family doesn't erase agreements. Family doesn't override signatures written in clear ink. The trustee's words from the previous week echoed quietly in my thoughts. Procedures protect relationships. Internal solutions don't hold, I said quietly. Not when the terms are already broken. My mother's face fell, her disappointment carving lines that hadn't been there before. My father looked away, unable to sit with the weight of accountability. The trustee seated beside me unfolded a document and placed it gently on the table. A template for an amendment, should anyone wish to propose one. The gesture was neutral, offering structure rather than judgment. "All changes must be written and signed," she explained. My sister's eyes flicked to the page, then back to me. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, softer now, her anger peeling back to reveal something closer to vulnerability. I didn't rush my answer. "Because without structure, we'd keep repeating this," I said. The trustee slid the amendment form closer, giving us space to choose. For a moment, the room felt suspended, each of us hovering at the edge of a decision that would ripple outward no matter what we picked. I proposed a path forward. If my sister moved out immediately and agreed in writing not to resume occupancy, the sale could be halted. My words were steady, but my chest felt tight, not with doubt, but with the weight of giving them a final opportunity to restore balance. The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. My sister's fists clenched at her sides. She looked down, then away, then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, some blend of pride and resentment. "I'm not leaving," she said finally. "I deserve a place too." My mother flinched. My father's shoulders sagged. The clarity of her refusal settled into the room like dust. The trustee nodded once, marking the decision officially. My sister stepped back, her face closing off. "You always make everything harder," she muttered before turning away. My mother reached for her but hesitated, unsure where comfort belonged anymore. I stood still, letting the moment breathe. There is a point in every conflict where possibility dissolves and only direction remains. We had reached it. My father whispered, "We tried," though even he didn't sound convinced. I gathered the documents, careful and calm, and placed them back into my folder. "We move forward, then," I said quietly. Not with anger, with certainty. Outside, dusk deepened into night, drawing a thin, inevitable line between what was and what would come next. The meeting room for our final discussion was smaller than the previous one, its walls closer, its lighting softer, as if intentionally designed to contain tension rather than dissolve it. The same 3 pens had been placed neatly in the center of the table, aligned with almost ceremonial precision. My parents sat down first, quieter than I'd ever seen them. My sister arrived last, sliding into her seat with an expression that oscillated between defiance and fatigue. I opened the binder, the sound of the clasp clicking, echoing faintly through the room. The trustee reviewed the agenda with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the process. My mother clutched a tissue in her hand, folding and unfolding the edges. My father kept his gaze fixed on the tabletop. No one spoke until the trustee invited me to begin. I summarized the steps we had taken: the notices, the meetings, the corrective period, the refusal to comply. My tone remained steady, measured, stripped of accusation. My voice didn't waver, even when I caught the hurt flickering across my mother's face. "We're here to finalize the written record," I said. My sister leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from defiance to something less stable, uncertainty maybe. She wasn't used to structure holding its ground. My father's hands trembled slightly as he intertwined his fingers. He wanted a softer path, but softer paths had brought us here. I kept my focus on the facts, not the emotion pressing against the edges of the room. Families can hold grief and clarity at the same time. It's just rarely comfortable. My mother whispered that she wished things could go back to normal, her voice thinned by exhaustion. I felt the sting of that wish, its sincerity, its impossibility. "Normal only works when boundaries are respected," I said gently. She nodded, wiping her eyes, not in disagreement but in recognition. My words weren't harsh, they were unavoidable. My sister's gaze darted between us, her posture tightening. She had always counted on my parents to shield her from accountability. But even they couldn't bend the document anymore. The trustee confirmed that emotional preference couldn't alter contractual terms. My sister looked away, jaw clenched. I didn't lean in to comfort. Love doesn't require surrendering clarity. Sometimes it requires holding it, even when the room feels like it might split along its seams. The trustee slid the final version of the compliance record across the table. The sound was soft, almost tender, yet it carried an undeniable finality. My father reached for the pen first. His hand shook, but his signature was deliberate, evenly spaced, as though acknowledging what he had resisted for weeks. My mother signed next, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. I didn't reach across to stop them. People must be allowed to feel the truth of their choices. When the pen reached my sister, she stared at the paper as if it were written in a language she had never learned. "I guess you win," she muttered. "This isn't a win," I replied softly. "It's a record." After a tense pause, she signed, the ink leaving a sharp, quick mark on the page. I added my signature last, my hand steady as I wrote each letter of my name. No triumph, no satisfaction, just completion. The trustee gathered the pages, clipped them neatly, and confirmed that the house would proceed to listing and sale as outlined in the trust. My mother whispered a soft apology, one not for wrongdoing, but for the sadness that had found its way into the process. I thanked her quietly, not as comfort, but as acknowledgement. My father's shoulders slumped, and he rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm. My sister stared down at her hands, tracing a line on the table as though searching for an escape that no longer existed. The room felt heavy, but honest. When the meeting ended, the trustee snapped the binder shut with a small, precise sound, a punctuation mark rather than a conclusion. We all stood slowly, as if adjusting to a new gravity. My parents moved toward the door first, holding each other's arms for balance, not support. My sister lingered behind them, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't fully interpret, part resentment, part understanding, part something unnamed. I didn't move to bridge the distance. Some distances are necessary to preserve what remains. I gathered my folder, holding it with both hands, the weight familiar and anchoring. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt no victory, no relief, only a steady sense of alignment. We had written the truth down, in ink, where it could no longer shift. The listing went live on a Thursday morning. The agent sent me the link at 8:07 a.m., along with a tidy summary of scheduled showings for the weekend. I stared at the photos, the brightened kitchen, the living room with carefully staged throws, my old bedroom now emptied of my sister's belongings and rearranged to look neutral and inviting. It felt surreal that the house I'd given to my parents was now presented to strangers as a possibility rather than a promise. Within an hour, inquiry notifications began arriving in my email inbox, each one a small reminder that the process had moved from private struggle to public transaction. I brewed a cup of coffee in my tiny rental kitchen and watched the steam rise. There was no going back. There was only forward motion, step by step, clean and precise. When I visited the house that afternoon, boxes were scattered across the living room, my parents packing under the quiet guidance of necessity rather than intention. My mother held a picture frame wrapped in newspaper, pausing as she smoothed the paper over the corners. My father taped a box shut with slow, deliberate movements. "We're getting there," he said, though the words felt more like reassurance for himself than for me. I helped where I could without intruding, lifting stacks of books, labeling cartons, carrying out small tasks that didn't require conversation. I could feel the ache beneath their silence, but I didn't feel it. Not all silences need rescuing. Sometimes they're the only space people have to reconcile their own decisions. The agent called while I was sorting linens in the hallway closet. She said we already had several strong inquiries and that the open house slots were nearly full. I could hear my father listening from across the hall. His shoulders stiffened, then relaxed, an acceptance settling over him. Not of the sale itself, but of the inevitability that had led us here. My mother asked quietly whether the new owners would care for the garden. I told her I didn't know, but the truth was the garden would belong to whoever came next, just as the house once belonged to us. She nodded, her eyes softening as she folded another towel. My sister wasn't there. She'd chosen absence once the process became real, a pattern I'd stopped expecting to change. Later, the agent arrived with printed packets detailing offers, timelines, and contingencies. She spread the pages across the dining table like a quiet map of possibilities. I asked her to break down each option: inspection conditions, financing strength, projected closing dates. She explained them clearly, relieved perhaps to work with someone who preferred clarity over guesswork. My parents sat across from us, silently absorbing the information. The house had been theirs in feeling, but now it belonged to the process. My mother touched a corner of the packet, her fingers trembling only slightly. My father asked a practical question about timing, and the agent answered with calm professionalism. We were no longer navigating emotion. We were navigating logistics. It was, strangely, easier. With the offers summarized, I requested the comparison chart the agent had prepared. It displayed each buyer's details in quiet columns: price, contingencies, closing period. The simplicity of the layout eased something inside me. Numbers tell the truth without emotion. My father leaned in, reading carefully, his brow furrowed not in distress, but in concentration. My mother whispered that the second offer seemed steady. I agreed. We discussed the inspection clause, the financing guarantee, the timeline. These were the kinds of conversations we should have had from the beginning: clear, documented, grounded. When the agent confirmed the plan, I approved the next step: presenting a counteroffer aligned with the trust's requirements. My father nodded, the first sign of calm I'd seen in weeks. After the agent left, I stood alone in the quiet house, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of packing materials in the other room. There was no triumph in the air, no bitterness, just a slow, steady settling of reality. My parents were preparing to leave. The house was preparing to change hands. And I was preparing to close a chapter I had once built with hope rather than caution. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, the late sunlight stretching across the grass. Everything felt smaller but clearer. I whispered to myself, almost inaudibly, "Move forward with precision." Then I turned off the kitchen light and stepped outside, letting the door close gently behind me. The agent emailed the comparison table just past noon, a clean spreadsheet of numbers, contingencies, and estimated closing timelines. I opened it at my desk, the soft hum of the rental's heater filling the quiet room. Each offer was laid out in orderly columns: purchase price, inspection terms, financing strength, closing flexibility. I studied the details with the same focus I used when drafting the trust years ago. Numbers have no agenda, they simply exist. My parents joined the call a few minutes later, and I shared my screen, guiding them through the breakdown with calm clarity. My father leaned in close to his laptop, his eyes narrowing as he read each line. My mother listened quietly, absorbing the information with slow, steady breaths. It felt like the first time in months that we were all looking in the same direction. I highlighted the risks tied to one of the higher offers, a waived inspection clause that looked attractive but carried significant uncertainty. "This is red," I said gently, circling it on the chart. My mother frowned, asking what could happen if we accepted it. I explained the potential liabilities, the financial unpredictability, the possibility of post-closing disputes. She nodded slowly, relief crossing her face when I recommended avoiding it. My father murmured that the second offer seemed more stable, and I agreed. It wasn't the highest, but it was the most secure. Clean financing, straightforward contingencies, a closing date that aligned with their needs. For once, practicality outweighed emotion. It was a small but steady shift, like a tide turning without noise. When the agent joined the call, she confirmed our reasoning and offered a clear path forward. Counter slightly, maintain the inspection requirement, and solidify the closing terms. My parents listened carefully, asking questions with a thoughtfulness I hadn't seen from them since the beginning of this ordeal. My mother asked about temporary housing options during the transition. The agent provided a list. My father asked about the buyer's financial history. The agent pulled up records. Everything was transparent, documented, grounded in facts rather than fear. I felt something inside me ease. Not relief exactly, but alignment. This was how we should have worked together all along. Calm, informed, structured. Emotion didn't disappear, it just flowed around the foundation instead of eroding it. After the call ended, my father stayed behind on the line. His voice was quieter, less guarded. "You handled that well," he said. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. A recognition of the precision I had carried through this process, even when it made me the difficult one. I thanked him softly. My mother reappeared, joining the conversation, to say she felt better understanding the options. "It's easier when everything is clear," she admitted. It was the closest she'd come to saying the structure mattered as much as the sentiment. I felt a small warmth, not victory, but connection, thin, tentative, but real. They might not agree with every step I took, but they understood why I took them. That evening, the agent sent an updated timeline based on the chosen offer. I forwarded it to my parents, with a short message explaining the next steps. My sister wrote for the first time in days. "Are you really going through with this?" Her words were sharp but unsteady, as if written from a place of disbelief rather than defiance. I replied with the truth. "We're following the agreement, no embellishment, no argument." She read the message but didn't respond. My mother texted later, asking if I would be available to help pack her plants. I said yes. Not everything had to be lost. Some things could still be shared. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment, letting the quiet settle. The heater clicked softly in the background, pushing warm air into the room. This phase of the process, numbers, documents, decisions, felt strangely grounding. Painful, yes, but grounded. I thought about fairness, not as a feeling but as a structure. Something you build intentionally so no one has to guess where the lines are. I whispered a small affirmation under my breath. Stay aligned, stay clear. The rest would unfold as it needed to. I turned off the light and let the room fall into darkness, knowing we had moved from turbulence into direction, from conflict into resolution by deliberate, measured steps. The earnest money deposit landed in the escrow account early Monday morning. The agent forwarded the confirmation at 7:12 a.m., her message crisp and efficient. By then, the closing date had already been set, 2 weeks out, contingent only on final signatures and inspection. I sat at the small desk in my rental, reviewing each document one more time. The language was clean, the contingencies clear, the timeline precise. Outside, the city was waking up. Distant traffic, a dog barking, the mechanical clatter of a garbage truck. Inside, everything felt still, as though the air were holding space for what was about to happen. This stage wasn't emotional, it was procedural. And yet I could feel the weight of it settling across my shoulders like a quiet acknowledgement that something significant was reaching its end point. At the signing appointment, I arrived a few minutes early, taking a seat in the lobby while flipping through the pages one last time. My notes from the past weeks, logs, timestamps, evidence, clarifications, floated through my mind. Not as grievances, but as a roadmap that had brought me here. When my parents walked in, my mother offered a small, tired smile. My father nodded, his posture straighter than usual, as if standing tall might steady what he felt inside. The closing agent led us to a small room with a smooth wooden table, a stack of documents laid out in a sequence that left no room for confusion. She explained each section calmly, the transfer, the final disclosures, the escrow instructions. No tension, just steps. As I signed the seller's documents, my hand moved with quiet certainty. Years ago, I'd imagined signing papers for a home I was buying, not one I was letting go of. But certainty doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like completion. My parents took their turns afterward. My father's hand shook more than I expected, the pen tapping the paper once before he steadied it. My mother wiped her eyes discreetly, pausing between signatures to breathe. Grief has many shapes. Today theirs was small and quiet, tucked between pen strokes. I didn't interrupt. I didn't soothe. I simply sat beside them, allowing the moment to exist without commentary. The agent reviewed each signed page, flipping them with gentle, practiced motions. "Everything looks correct," she said, her tone warm but professional. Beside her, the buyer's attorney nodded in agreement. My mother tightened her grip on her handbag. My father exhaled a breath that felt years long. I reminded them softly, "Everyone here is being treated according to the terms we wrote." It wasn't consolation, it was truth. And truth, even when heavy, carries a steadiness emotion can't provide. My mother reached out and briefly touched my wrist, a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone else. I felt the warmth of it linger longer than the contact itself. When the last signature was complete, the closing agent snapped the folder shut with a kind of gentle finality. No drama, no raised voices, just the quiet sound of completion. She congratulated us, though none of us felt celebratory. My father stood slowly, straightening his jacket. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue she had folded and refolded throughout the meeting. "Everyone has been fair," she said quietly, almost to herself. I nodded. Fairness had been the goal even if it didn't feel comforting today. Fairness isn't always soft. Sometimes it's just accurate. My parents gathered their belongings, moving with the tenderness of people carrying something fragile but invisible. As we walked out of the office, sunlight cut across the floor in clean, sharp lines. My parents paused near the exit, adjusting to the brightness. I held the final packet of documents in my hand, its weight steady, its edges firm. For the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the release that comes from reaching the end of a difficult truth without abandoning yourself. We stepped outside together, each of us quiet in our own way. The day felt brighter than it should have, as if unaware of the heaviness we carried. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, grounding myself in the simple fact that what needed to be done had been done, with clarity, with consistency, with care. Early the next morning, I returned to the house one final time. The air felt crisp, sharper than usual, as though the neighborhood itself understood a chapter was ending. I walked through each room with the buyer's inspection checklist in hand, testing light switches, running faucets, listening to the soft hum of the appliances I once replaced. Everything still worked. Everything still held. My parents moved slowly behind me, checking drawers and cupboards, making sure nothing was left behind but a clean space for the next family. Outside, the lawn swayed lightly in the breeze, untouched by the decisions unfolding inside. There was no ceremony to the moment, just quiet responsibility, handled piece by piece. In the kitchen, I took final photos of the counters, the sink, the cabinets. The refrigerator beeped softly as I confirmed its temperature settings. My mother stood at the doorway, holding a small potted plant she hadn't decided whether to keep or leave. "Take it," I told her gently. "It should stay with you." She nodded, brushing a thumb over one of its leaves. My father checked the smoke detectors and thermostat controls, performing tasks he'd done 100 times before, though today they felt more like farewells than routine. There was a softness to his movements, a quiet reverence, as though understanding had finally settled where resistance once stood. We moved through the house slowly, not delaying, just acknowledging. When it was time, I placed the keys in a plain white envelope. There were 3 sets, one for the buyers, one for escrow, one marked final copy. I sealed the envelope with a steady hand and felt an unexpected calm settle in my chest. The agent arrived moments later, greeting us with professional warmth. She reviewed the final checklist, confirmed the handover timeline, and asked if we wanted a few minutes alone before leaving. My parents nodded. The agent stepped outside, giving us space. My sister was not there. Her absence felt familiar now, a quiet certainty rather than a wound. She had chosen distance at the moment accountability required presence. I no longer expected anything different. My mother stood in the living room, her gaze drifting across the empty walls. "We made good memories here," she said softly. I nodded. Memories don't belong to properties, they travel. My father approached me with slow steps. He didn't speak at first. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, the gesture steady and warm. "You did what was right," he said finally. His voice was subdued, but sincere. It wasn't a concession, it was acceptance. A recognition that boundaries were not weapons, they were structure, protection, truth. My mother wrapped her arm around his, leaning gently into him. For the first time since the conflict began, I felt the room lighten, not because the pain was gone, but because the clarity had settled. I sent the handover confirmation email from my phone, subject line, production property transfer finalized. I attached the photos, the checklist, the envelope verification, no emotion, just facts, aligned in sequence. The agent re-entered the house, collecting the envelope and confirming the transfer timestamp. My mother whispered a quiet goodbye to the space, not dramatic, just honest. My father locked the door, testing the latch one final time before handing the entire set to the agent. The click of the lock echoed softly through the hallway, small, precise, final. The house was no longer ours, but nothing inside me felt lost, only completed. We stepped outside, the door closing behind us with a gentle sound that barely rose above the breeze. My mother paused on the porch, smoothing her jacket as if preparing herself for the next, quieter chapter. My father inhaled deeply, shoulders lifting, then lowering with resignation and calm. My sister remained absent, but the 3 of us stood together, a smaller circle, but a steadier one. I typed the final confirmation to escrow and CC'd everyone involved. Then I slipped my phone into my pocket and looked at the house one last time. No bitterness, no regret. Just a clean line drawn where it needed to be. We walked to the car without speaking, the morning light stretching long shadows ahead of us. The handover was done. In the days after the handover, the silence felt different, no longer strained but spacious. I returned to my rental and cleared the stack of closing documents from my desk, placing each one into a labeled folder. Final transfer, escrow release, inspection records, communication logs. The organization felt grounding, not obsessive, just the last step in giving the process a clean ending. I wiped down the desk afterward, letting the empty surface breathe. Outside, faint traffic hummed through the window screen, steady and indifferent. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't buzzing with updates, inquiries, or disputes. The quiet wasn't unsettling. It was restorative, like the slow settling of dust after a long, loud construction. I sat back in my chair and let the calm settle across my shoulders. Completion has its own kind of peace. My parents called 2 evenings later. They were staying in a short-term rental nearby, smaller, simpler, but warm. My mother described the place with gentle optimism. A little balcony, sunlight in the mornings, a kitchenette she was already reorganizing. My father stressed that they were fine, repeating it more for himself than for me. I listened, offering steady reassurance. Not comfort in the form of promises, but clarity in the form of presence. They sounded lighter, as if the weight of the house had been heavier than they ever admitted. My mother said, almost shyly, "It feels manageable." That word stayed with me. Not perfect, not ideal, manageable. A truthful word, a grounded one. I held on to it. The next day, I picked them up to help shop for essentials, small items they couldn't bring from the old house. We moved slowly through the aisles, bedding, dish towels, a modest lamp for their living room. My father compared prices with unexpected diligence, while my mother debated over the softness of towels like she was choosing emotions, not linens. We loaded the bags into the trunk, none of us mentioning the past weeks. There was no need. The absence of conflict didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like a mutual agreement to let the dust settle before examining the foundation again. In the quiet moments between errands, I noticed something subtle. My parents were working together, not against the weight of a situation they couldn't face. Later, I drove them back to their rental. My mother invited me in for tea and I accepted, not out of obligation but out of a calm willingness to share a quiet hour. We sat at the small dining table, the steam rising in gentle spirals from our cups. The space felt modest but warm, and my parents seemed content in a way that felt new. My father mentioned he might start looking for a more permanent place when things settle further. My mother nodded, adding that she wanted somewhere simple and peaceful. I didn't rush them with suggestions. Not every next step needs to be planned immediately. Sometimes it's enough to sit in the soft pause after a long, complicated chapter, and let stillness guide the next thought. That night after leaving their rental, I parked my car for a moment before heading inside my own place. The streetlights glowed softly, casting a warm haze across the pavement. I thought about everything we had survived. The breach, the denial, the meetings, the signatures. None of it had been easy, but it had been necessary. Boundaries had held, truth had held, and the relationships, though altered, hadn't shattered. I exhaled slowly, letting the breath expand the quiet inside my chest. Even in difficulty, fairness had carried us through, step by step. My phone buzzed once, my mother sending a photo of her newly arranged balcony. A small plant on a small table. A beginning. Inside my apartment, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the night settle into its familiar rhythm. I felt no triumph, no lingering ache, only a clean, steady sense of alignment. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ordered, clear, honest. The house was gone, the conflict resolved, the boundaries restored. And somewhere in a modest rental across town, my parents were drinking tea under a softer light, starting again, with more clarity than before. I held the cool glass in my hands and whispered to myself, barely audible, "Keep moving with precision." The night outside was quiet, and for the first time, so was I. I didn't hear from my sister for nearly a week. Not a message, not a call. Just the quiet ripple of her absence, settling into the spaces where tension once lived. One evening, as I was sorting paperwork at my dining table, her name finally appeared on my phone. The text was short. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long moment, feeling neither dread nor anticipation, just a grounded readiness. I replied with a simple, yes. We met the next day at a small cafe halfway between us. She arrived late, shoulders tight, eyes guarded. For once, she didn't lead with excuses. She just sat there, picking at the edge of her coffee cup, waiting for me to speak first. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Some conversations need space before they begin. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said finally, her voice quieter than I expected. She didn't look at me. Her gaze stayed fixed on the foam swirling in her cup. I nodded, Not to agree, but to acknowledge the honesty in her admission. She clarified that she hadn't meant to cause so much upheaval, that she thought things would work out somehow. I recognized the pattern, her tendency to rely on time and emotion to solve problems that required structure and clarity. It wasn't about punishment, I said calmly. It was about honoring what we wrote. She exhaled sharply, somewhere between a sigh and a release. I know, she murmured. There was no defensiveness in her tone, just fatigue. See. She apologized, the words careful but genuine. Not dramatic, not embellished, simply a quiet acknowledgement of the choices she made and the consequences that followed. I listened without stepping in to soften it. Apologies need to land on their own feet. When she finally met my eyes, hers looked different. Less pride, more awareness. I didn't think the agreement mattered that much, she admitted. I do now. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she didn't hide it. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I meant it. Not because it erased what happened, but because it recognized something essential. The importance of boundaries in relationships that want to survive. She asked if things between us could go back to how they were. The question hung between us like a suspended weight, not heavy but immovable. I didn't answer quickly. I don't think they can, I said gently. But that doesn't mean they can't be steady. She nodded, absorbing the reality. Some relationships don't return to their former shape. They shift, they reset. They find new forms that hold differently, sometimes more honestly, sometimes more carefully. She admitted she had leaned on my parents' reluctance to enforce things. I pushed because I thought no one would really follow through, she said. I didn't need to add anything. The truth was already fully revealed in her words. When we finished our coffee, she asked if we could create some distance for a while. A pause, not an ending. I agreed. Space isn't abandonment, it's protection. We stood outside the cafe, neither of us reaching for a hug. Instead, she offered a small nod, a gesture that felt more sincere than any physical embrace could have. Thank you for meeting me, she said. I nodded back. Traffic passed steadily behind us, life moving forward around a conversation that had taken years to arrive at. She walked away first, her steps slow but certain. I didn't watch her disappear, just breathed in, letting the moment end without lingering. Later that night, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, letting the quiet settle around me. The conversation hadn't healed everything, but it had clarified enough. Enough to let the past stay in its place. Enough to let the future unfold without resentment pulling at its edges. I opened a clean page in my notebook and wrote one sentence. Distance can be a form of respect. I closed the notebook, feeling a soft, steady exhale leave my chest. The chapter was nearing its end, not with conflict, but with a calmer kind of truth, the kind that stays. A few weeks later, life settled into a quieter shape. My parents were adjusting to their new place, smaller, yes, but strangely peaceful. The air there felt lighter, as if the walls weren't carrying the weight of unspoken tensions anymore. I visited one afternoon with groceries, and my mother showed me how she'd arranged her small balcony garden. The little plant she saved from the old house sat in a patch of sunlight, looking more alive than I'd ever seen it. My father was assembling a modest bookshelf in the corner, humming under his breath, a rare sound I hadn't heard in years. Nothing looked extravagant. Everything looked grounded. I realized then that simplicity hadn't taken anything from them. It had given them room to breathe. We spent part of the afternoon unpacking the last few boxes. My father handed me an old photo album, the edges slightly frayed. We flipped through it together, page by page. Birthdays, road trips, small celebrations captured in imperfect snapshots. The memories didn't feel tied to any particular house. They lived in the people who'd created them. My mother watched us from the kitchen doorway, a soft smile forming behind her tired eyes. For the first time, I sensed they weren't mourning what they'd lost. They were adjusting to what they'd kept. When my father closed the album, he squeezed my hand gently. "We're okay," he said. And this time, it didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like truth. Later, we sat down for tea. Steam curled from the cups, drifting toward the small window where afternoon light pooled like warm water. My mother admitted she hadn't realized how tense she'd become living inside a situation she felt powerless to manage. "It's quieter here," she said. "Quieter in a good way." My father nodded, adding that the trust structure, though difficult, had prevented something far worse. I didn't respond with, "I told you so." I didn't need to. Their acknowledgement wasn't validation, it was alignment. We were finally speaking the same language, one built on clarity instead of assumption, honesty instead of hope that things would magically resolve. It felt steady. It felt earned. That evening, I helped my father adjust the new curtains they'd bought. My mother placed fresh lemons in a small bowl on the counter, insisting the color brightened the room. Everything about the new space felt intentional. Modest choices made without fear of judgment or conflict. When I stepped onto the balcony, the air was cool, the city humming in the distance with its usual rhythm. The plant she'd carried from the old house swayed gently in the breeze. It struck me that some things survive transition not because they're protected from disruption, but because they're tended with care afterward. My mother joined me outside, leaning her elbows on the railing. "Thank you for staying steady," she said softly. I nodded, absorbing the words without needing to reply. Before leaving, I stood near the doorway, taking in the small details. The chairs aligned neatly, the soft light settling in the corners, the faint scent of my mother's cooking drifting from the kitchen. None of it looked like the home they once had, but all of it looked like a place they could grow from. My father gave me a quiet, grateful nod. My mother hugged me briefly, careful, almost gentle. "We're starting over," she whispered. Not dramatically, not sorrowfully, simply acknowledging the truth. Every family rebuilds at some point. The important part is how they rebuild. With honesty, with boundaries, with a willingness to learn from the fractures, instead of pretending they never happened. When I stepped outside into the evening air, the sky held a fading shade of gold, the kind that makes even ordinary streets look momentarily cinematic. I walked to my car with a steady sense of closure. Not the heavy kind that clamps down on you, but the soft kind that settles when the truth has finally been carried through to completion. I glanced back once. My parents were standing by the window, silhouettes against their small, warm space. Not defeated, not diminished, just different and freer. I took a long breath, letting it fill the quiet inside me. This chapter had been difficult, necessary, clarifying, and now, gently, it had come to rest. I opened the car door and whispered to myself, steady and calm, "Move forward with honesty." Then I drove into the evening, letting the story close where it needed to. In the end, nothing exploded, nothing shattered. There was no dramatic collapse, only a quiet realignment of what had always been fragile. My parents found peace in the smaller home that didn't carry the weight of unspoken expectations. My sister stepped back, giving space for the truth to settle, even if she wasn't ready to fully face it. And I learned that boundaries, real, written, honored. Don't destroy families. They steady them. Looking back, I don't feel triumphant, nor bitter, just clear. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let a situation continue in the dark. Sometimes the strongest thing you can offer is a line that does not move. Life didn't return to what it was before. It became something quieter, steadier, more honest. My parents laugh more now. I breathe easier. And the distance we've placed between the fault lines has kept everything from breaking again. If you've ever carried a responsibility no one else understood, or had to protect your peace in ways that felt lonely, tell me your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. And if this story touched you, even in a small way, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one.